Howdy, everybody. So, picking up on our next lecture, we are going to begin the Cold War. We kind of touched on it tail end of last lecture after the end of World War II. We had dropped the atomic bomb. The war had come to an end with the defeat of Japan finally, but it's going to be this relationship with the last two remaining world powers, the United States, and to a much lesser extent, right at the end of World War II, Russia. Pretty much everyone else had been beaten down so bad by the war, the United States was really the only one left standing. But very quickly, Russia is going to begin competing and catching up, and this is where we get the heart of the Cold War. So Harry S. Truman takes over for FDR after FDR dies in office just after getting elected to his fourth term. Now, like we talked about last time, no one really knew what to make of Truman, but nonetheless, he is going to make do with what he has. Now, immediately after World War II, some interesting stuff is going to start happening. Mainly, Europe, in particular England, is going to come to the United States and ask for resources, supplies, funds to help rebuild. And we, as good friends, good allies, good neighbors, will give them all the resources they need. So, we gave England a $3.45 billion loan to help them rebuild. However, when the Russians, also our ally during World War II, come to us and ask for the exact same aid, we say no. We refuse Stalin and we refuse the Soviet Union, despite them being our former ally. We do this for some very particular reasons. If you remember, we had already had one Red Scare, a communist scare in the United States. Remember that guy, Martin Dies? He had kind of gone crazy at one point in time. And this idea is still percolating. We see communism as incompatible with capitalism, with democracy. So we don't want to support it. We don't want to prop it up. But in avoiding it, in trying to oppose aiding our former ally, we end up making an enemy. And they decide to prove us wrong, to compete with us directly. And this is the heart of the Cold War, this competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, between Russia and the US, and between capitalism and democracy versus communism and socialism. So which one will win out is the heart of the Cold War. Now, there's this fear that communism is spreading everywhere, all across Europe. It seems like it's spreading across the whole European continent, and there's nothing to really stop it. And this is when Truman decides to take a stand to try to halt the expansion of communism. Because keep in mind, most of Europe is ravaged by war. And communism, promising equality for all, resources for workers, benefits, is going to seem very appetizing. But Truman is going to try to put a stop to that. And he's going to give a speech in March of 1947 called the Truman Doctrine, in which he will say on March 12th of 1947 that we should contain the expansion of communism. So we get that containment policy. Now, in the present crisis, he said, quote, every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. One way, quote, guaranteed individual liberty, and the other promoted terror and oppression, saying American democracy and capitalism is individual liberty, but communism is terror and oppression. He said there's no middle ground in a world of good and evil. Truman declared it, quote, must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples everywhere who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside influence. Now, outside influence is the communists, is the USSR, and armed minorities are communists within the countries in Europe. That is, ultimately, we must resist communism anywhere in the world it begins to pop up. So this is called the Truman Doctrine, also the containment policy. Now, Truman in 1948 has to run for re-election in his own right, and he does pretty well. So you have Harry S. Truman running for the Democrats, a guy named Thomas Dewey for the Republicans, and a guy named Strom Thurmond for the Dixiecrats. Now, the Dixiecrats are Deep South kind of idea, and the main idea they're pushing for is to maintain racial segregation. And you can see it's popular in the Deep South, but not really anywhere else. So We'll come back to Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats and racial segregation when we get to the beginning of the civil rights movement. It's the late 1950s. But speaking back on the Cold War, first big issue that's going to pop up is a coup, a military coup, a military overthrow of the government in Czechoslovakia in February of 1948. This is when Czechoslovakian communists overthrow the government and turn it communist. And they would remain in power for the next 4 decades. This is going to help fan fears in the United States of communism spreading across Europe, and thus the need to rebuild a solid, capitalist, democratic Europe to face off and resist the expansion of communism. And it's going to be an American politician, a guy named George Marshall, our Secretary of State, that between 1948 and 1952 is going to implement what's called the Marshall Plan. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to give a blank check to any European nation that wants to rebuild. We say, you come up with a plan to rebuild your country, we'll write you a loan, you rebuild it how you see fit, as long as it's capitalist and democratic and all these types of things. You build it back up, we will support you, we will be allies with you. And the US will send over $12 billion in aid to European nations. And this is going to be one of the most successful rebuilding programs in world history. And it does a lot of good for the United States and for Europe. And it is a great boon to many of these Western societies. But it's not only this Marshall Plan that is our defense against communism. We are starting to streamline some of our other defensive mechanisms. So in 1947, Truman will help pass the National Security Act, which combined all of our armed forces into one Department of Defense. So instead of having Department of the Navy, Department of the Army, Department of the Air Force, of the Marines, all these different kinds of things, you had one Department of Defense overseeing everything else. We kind of learned this lesson from World War II with Eisenhower being an overall commander and Nimitz being an overall commander, and kind of how that system worked and how it worked fairly well. Now, it's during this time that we also have the National Security Council. And the council is designed to be a group of people that provide foreign policy suggestions and advice and guidance to the president. And this is going to grow in power over the next few years, over the next few decades. And then finally, we established the Central Intelligence Agency. So while the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, handles policing and investigations within the United States, the CIA is going to handle kind of spying and espionage outside the United States. So in theory, the CIA should never be operating within the United States without being some sort of joint task force with a US agency. Now, the first major contention between the US and the USSR is going to be over Berlin. And you can kind of see on the map here. So the red zone is the Soviet zone. That's the portion of Germany controlled by Russia. So the British, American, and French zones eventually combine into Western Germany. But Eastern Germany belongs to the Russians. Now Berlin is split up in a very similar way. But the problem is, West Berlin, which is controlled by the rest of the Allied powers, is in the heart of Soviet territory. And Russia wants all of Berlin. So Russia decides we're going to blockade, completely cut off all supplies, no roads, no rivers, no railroads coming into Berlin. So they're trying to starve out West Berlin so that the Western powers will give up, surrender that portion of Berlin to Russia. So Russia will have the entire capital city of Berlin. So this is a very big deal. The United States, however, with our allies, began saying, okay, you want a blockade? That's fine. We're going to fly all of our resources in. Now, Russia thought this was impossible, that there would be no way to fly enough resources, fuel, food, supplies, to keep the city up and running. But we managed to do it. And for nearly a year, American pilots will fly in 2.5 million tons of food, fuel, and supplies into Western Berlin. Flights happen around 1,000 per day, or about 300,000 flights in total, in what became known as Operation Vittles, or Operation Food. So there's an even more interesting story kind of underlying all this. So there's one pilot, a guy named Gale Halvorson. That's a picture of him right there. Now, when he was one of these pilots flying in Operation Vittles, bringing food and fuel and all these kinds of things. Well, one time when he had leave in Berlin, he noticed all the kids in the city didn't have a whole lot of luxury goods. They didn't have a lot of toys, didn't have a lot of candy, none of these kinds of things, because they weren't essential goods that year to maintain, survival in the midst of the blockade. So what he did is he got his chocolate from his ration pack and went to all his buddies, got all their chocolates and gave them out to the kids. The kids would have a little candy treat. And he saw how happy it made the kids, kind of just this happy little gesture turned into this big thing. So what he does when he gets back to base in West Germany, he goes and rounds up as much chocolate and candy as he could, and he begins tying little parachutes to it. So the next time he flies a run over Berlin, he drops candy out the window, and he becomes known as the Candy Bomber. And he even had a little trademark. Whenever he flew over the city, he would rock his wings back and forth to signal that it was his plane dropping candy. Now, one day when he got back to base, his commander, Lieutenant General William H. Turner, called him in and ordered him to explain himself, what he was doing. And Halvorson thought he was at the end of his rope. But instead, the general loved the idea, thought it was not only, way to keep the kids happy, but also a good PR move to make the Russians look really bad. So they start what's known as Operation Little Vittles, so candy. So you're going to have millions of tons of candy being dropped on Berlin as a way to basically show the world that Russia's literally trying to take candy from a child. So, as the news of Operation Little Vittles spreads across the United States, children and candy makers from all across the U.S. begin sending supplies and candy and all these kinds of things. Public support led to donations, which enabled Halvorson and his crew to drop 850 pounds of candy, just his one plane. By the end of the airlift, some 25 aircraft crews had dropped 23 tons of chocolate, chewing gum, and other candies over various places in Berlin. So this is a massive operation and a massive PR move against the Russians. And finally, the blockade was lifted on May 12th, 1949, and the Soviets had to acknowledge this had been a failure. They underestimated the ability of the American Air Force to fly this much and this many supplies and resources in. But the US was kind of poked at this point. We were agitated by what the Russians tried to do. So we decided to ally ourselves with the other Western powers in Europe. This is the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, this is partially because of the coup in Czechoslovakia, but also because of the blockade in West Berlin. So in April of 1949, they create NATO. Now, the founding idea was mutual protection. This isn't an aggressive alliance. No, if someone attacks someone, we don't have to join. But if one of the member nations gets attacked, we all come to their aid. Now, the 12 nations that made up NATO, the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Italy, Portugal, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland. And very soon, once kind of rebuilding was done, West Germany joined as well. However, the Russians were left out. And the Russians didn't want to be left out. They wanted to be a member of a larger community, so they create their own club. They create what's called the Warsaw Pact. And they use the Soviet bloc as kind of their own alliance against NATO. So you can kind of see some of the countries serving as that buffer zone for Russia and the Soviet Union is also going to be members of this Warsaw Pact. By 1948, the Cold War is in full swing, but it would heat up to unprecedented levels during the 1950s because of two extremely important developments that would ratchet up tensions between the United States and the USSR, our Cold War adversaries. First and foremost, the Russians get the bomb. Now, we thought that was our secret technology, that no one else in the world had nuclear weapons. Somehow the Russians got the bomb, and to many Americans, it looked like someone was spying. Some secret spy had stolen our technology, our plans for a nuclear bomb, given them to Russia. That's the only way the Russians could have done it. So this is a huge fear for the United States, because now we're not the sole world power with nuclear capabilities. When we were, we could push people around. Now Russia has the same kind of threat, the same kind of power, and they are becoming a balancing power for the United States. The second big component of this fear is China falls to the communists. So Mao Zedong takes over and pushes China to be a communist nation. Now, following World War II, you have the Chinese nationalists, which were fighting for kind of a more capitalist, democratic version of China. We had been sponsoring them. We had spent about $2 billion trying to prop up the Chinese nationalists against Mao Zedong and his communists. However, by 1949, it became pretty obvious that the communists were going to win this kind of civil war. This meant that about 600 million Chinese were now going to be under communist rule, making communism a much larger threat than we had ever imagined. Now, this is known as the Chinese Revolution of 1949. Now, the capitalist side, the US support side, was led by Chiang Kai-shek. Now, after he is defeated by Mao Zedong, Chiang Kai-shek retreats to Taiwan, just off the coast of China. And this has been an issue with China ever since. China claims control of Taiwan, but many people in Taiwan claim independence and all this kind of stuff, and it's been a contentious point ever since this civil war, this Chinese revolution. So you've had the loss of nuclear technology, with the Russians getting the bomb, and China falling to the communists. So we start coming up with a new plan to contain communism. You can see everything in red. So you have the USSR in dark red, kind of that maroon color, which is the heart of communism. Everything in red is a communist nation. And then everything in the kind of light orange is going to be a communist influenced nation. So this is a pretty scary thing that's happening across the globe. We think communism is spreading unchecked. It's going to be the new world dominating kind of political scheme. So the United States, the National Security Council, is going to write a document called NSC Paper Number 68. And it's going to outline our policy for dealing with communism. So there's a few major parts to this. So in essence, the document was this. First, the US had to stop the advance of communism by an abundance of military power. 2, we must increase our peacetime military spending to unprecedented levels. Now, the result is going to be about $13 billion in peacetime. We're going to escalate that to about $50 billion a year. So we're going to spend more on our military than the next 2 or 3 nations behind us combined. So this is a massive economic investment. Third, we must build an even bigger nuclear bomb, the massive thermonuclear hydrogen bomb. If the Russians got the bomb, we have to have a bigger bomb. And fourth, we should work with other countries when we can, but if they won't help us, we'll fight communism alone. So this NSC document number 68 is going to lay the blueprint for how we're going to approach the Cold War over the next few years. Now, the first big escalation after this document comes out is going to be Korea. Now, after World War II, Korea had been split north and south, with the Western powers, mainly the US, controlling the southern portion and the Russians controlling the northern portion. And the goal was, at a certain date, they would hold an election and decide what their country wanted to be. In the case of Korea, Russia intervened, stopped the elections, did not want that to happen, and you have an invasion from Russia, from the Russia-controlled north, to invade South Korea to try to establish Korea as a unified communist country. But the United States pushes back. And Truman very quickly goes and asks at the United Nations for permission and a UN resolution to go in and stop this forcible takeover of South Korea. He gets his troops And it's going to be the U.S. General, Douglas McCarthy, that's given command of the United Nations forces to go in and try to figure out what we're going to do to find some military solution in Korea. Now, the U.S. aspect of the war begins with the Battle of Incheon. You kind of see it on that southern or the northern portion of the yellow piece, kind of on the left-hand coast of South Korea. We kind of loop around, attack from behind, attack the communists in the rear, and we managed to catch them off guard. And this is a massive military success for the United States. We land 40,000 UN troops, and this is a relatively easy capture of the city. Within a month and a half or so, MacArthur had managed to push the North Korean forces back north of the 38th parallel, that dividing line, in a stunning series of victories. And this is when MacArthur goes to Truman and says, can we march north? Can we go into North Korea and take the war to the north? Truman says yes, and we invade. But the problem is, when we cross that 38th parallel, begin an initially successful invasion of North Korea, China decides to come in and back up North Korea. And then now we're not just facing the North Koreans, we're facing the massive number of the Chinese army. And this is going to cause a massive setback. The United States is forced to retreat through kind of winter mountainous conditions, and we're going to take heavy losses. Time magazine at the time called it, quote, the worst military setback the U.S. had ever suffered. And by March of 1951, both sides are kind of staring at each other across this 38th parallel, and you have this standstill. And this is when Douglas MacArthur asks permission to do something else. He goes to Truman and he says, give me permission to use nuclear bombs. I'll bomb the hell out of China, and then I will invade and take North Korea. So he wanted to use nuclear weapons on China to gain control of North Korea. Now this is a massive escalation of forces. And when Truman refused, MacArthur went behind his back. So Douglas MacArthur went behind his back, wrote an open letter to Congress, lambasting the president, calling him an idiot, saying we need to do this. Now keep in mind, as a general of the United States, the president is his direct boss. Now when you start talking trash about your boss, what's probably going to happen? You're going to get fired. And that's exactly what happens to MacArthur. Truman has enough, fires MacArthur, and basically lets the stalemate continue. So we just keep staring at each other over this 38th parallel. This is kind of what we're still doing with North and South Korea today. So South Korea is kind of more independent than they have been in the past in regards to defending their northern border with North Korea. But the U.S. is there, and we do a lot of joint operations with South Korea. So it's kind of, the war's never technically ended. It's just been this stalemate for decades. We kind of have this armistice. So in North Korea, we lost about 50,000 Americans were killed, and another 103,000 were wounded in the fighting in Korea. That's nothing to say to the 2.4 million Korean civilians that were killed or injured. Now, in the midst of all this, something else is going to make things worse. So you have the escalation, the tensions building in Korea. And it felt like the U.S. was rapidly losing the Cold War, but it's going to get worse. So there's this growing fear among Americans that things are going badly on all fronts. And for the average American, how do you explain it? Well, there's going to be a not very well-known, a little-known politician that's going to give a speech in February of 1950. He's going to talk about the growing threat of communism. This guy's name is Joseph McCarthy. He's a senator from Wisconsin, and he had a bombshell for the American people. Now, McCarthy was not that smart, or in fact, all that original. The speech he's about to give is heavily plagiarized from another politician, another congressman named Richard Nixon. We'll talk more about Nixon a little later. But what's different about McCarthy is that he's willing to straight up lie to the American people in order to get what he wants. And he had a doozy for everyone. He said, quote, I have here in my hand a list of 205 communists that were made known to the Secretary of State and who are still working and shaping policy within the State Department. This blew Americans' minds. They're like, what? There's communist spies in our government and we know about them and we're not doing anything. But He lied. There were no names and there was no document. He just simply lied. And this is the fundamental problem. Now, he struck a nerve in the American people. We saw things that made sense. The only way communists could be winning all around the world is if they cheated, if they were spying and stealing information and sabotaging the United States. We won World War II. How could they be beating us? So, the problem with McCarthy's fear-mongering is there was just enough evidence of spying in the US to make Americans believe him. So the first big case is Alger Hiss. So in August of 1948, an editor at Times Magazine accused a man named Alger Hiss of being a communist spy for the Soviet Union. Now this editor knew he was a spy because, lo and behold, this editor claimed to be part of the Communist Party as well, and that they were both spies, and he was trying to out Alger Hiss. Now Hiss denied it on all fronts, on all accounts, and the statute of limitations had actually run out on Alger Hiss. He couldn't be tried for espionage. But they did put him on trial for perjury, for lying under oath about being a spy. After one mistrial, he was then convicted and sentenced to more than 5 years in prison. Then and now, there's not a whole lot of evidence whether or not he did it. He may have been a spy, he may not. We just don't really know. But just the idea that a high-ranking official in the State Department could have been a spy during World War II, could have been influencing FDR during World War II, sparked massive amounts of fear in America. And this is when McCarthy uses the House Un-American Activities Committee that we talked about a little bit earlier in the semester. He's going to use this as a way to hunt down other theoretical communists. Now he's going to go to the only place that makes sense, which is Hollywood. You get known as the Hollywood 10. They're going to hunt these people down. They're going to blacklist some people if they don't turn over communists, all this kind of stuff. It's a big mess. They don't find any real communists. But shortly after Alger Hiss was convicted, the FBI arrested Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And they were accused of even worse things than Alger Hiss. First and foremost, passing along atomic secrets to the Soviets, which of course could be used to create the atomic bomb that the Soviets now had. So this gave Americans someone to blame for the loss of our nuclear technology. Now the presiding judge declared that their crime was, quote, worse than murder in June of 1953. Both husband and wife were put to death by the federal government. Now it accomplished nothing in the end. It was all for show, but it represented the hysteria of the time, the fear of what was going on during kind of the early 1950s with this second Red Scare. Now, McCarthy represents better than anything the widespread fears during the early years of the Cold War that the Democrats were doing everything badly. So the Republicans were going to put up their own candidate, and they're going to choose none less than Dwight D. Eisenhower, the overall commander of the Allied forces. Now, it's hard to beat a man who launched D-Day, who helped win the war in Europe, as president. It's just going to be virtually impossible. Eisenhower will choose for his running mate a prominent congressman named Richard Nixon. So while Eisenhower was able to kind of be the face, talk about, American values and apple pie and all these kinds of things, Nixon could be the bulldog, could really attack and fight for Eisenhower. So Eisenhower got to look like the good guy, and Nixon could be the rough and tumble kind of guy. They were facing off the Democratic candidate, a guy named ADLAI Stevenson. Now, he was perfectly qualified, but he really never had a shot in hell of winning because he was facing off against Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower will win with a pretty handy margin, 34 million votes to 27, 442 electoral college votes to only 89. So this is a pretty massive electoral college win. Now, on top of just winning the presidential election, the Republicans also win in Congress as well, a slim majority. So Eisenhower is going to be supported by Congress. So it's going to make it easier for the Republicans to pass the laws they want. And it's going to be in this context that McCarthy begins to overreach. In particular, McCarthy is going to go after the U.S. Army. He's going to say, You know, there's communists in college, there's communists in Hollywood, but the true heart of communism is in the army. Now, this is a big problem when Eisenhower is the president. Eisenhower is a former general of the United States. The army is kind of his baby. So Eisenhower is not thrilled about the critique of the US Army. But he says, okay, you want to put the army on trial? Go for it. We're going to put these trials, however, on TV so the whole nation can watch what you do. And this is the kind of the big trick that Eisenhower pulled. Everyone's going to see what kind of farce McCarthy really is. So you have this massive trial. McCarthy and his supporters are going to have this big trial trying to put the army on trial to find communists within the thing. The hearings lasted for 36 days and were broadcast on ABC. Remember, TV was a hot new thing at the time in the 1950s, and 96% of homes had them by 1959. And these trials are going to be a hit rating. On the first day, 63% of all New York TV sets were tuned into the hearing. So 2/3, roughly, of all people watching TV were watching these trials. Keep in mind, there's only 3 channels. You have ABC, NBC, and CBS. So there's not a lot to watch anyways, but this really captured the American mind. Now, McCarthy berated and yelled at people the whole time, finding nothing in the process. But he did succeed in looking like a raging bully to the American public. Then the most famous exchange happened during these trials, which happened between McCarthy and the Army's chief lawyer. So there's McCarthy and Ed Colm, one of his kind of right-hand men. But here is Joseph Welch, the Army's head lawyer. And after McCarthy has been yelling and lambasting a young man for being a potential communist or for being a theoretical communist, Welch finally has enough, and he yells in response, "Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You have done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last? Have you no sense of decency?" And there's applause in the Senate galleries as he says this. Finally, someone's calling McCarthy out on all his crap. And it proves to the American people that McCarthy is kind of making all this up, that he's pulling it out of his ass. It's not really about hunting communists. It's about kind of his own self-aggrandizement. He's just using the hunt for communists as an excuse, as a justification for what he's doing. And it's going to be after these trials that McCarthy basically fades to obscurity. Now, it's not just him that is the Red Scare. The Red Scare is a mindset. And even though McCarthy kind of fades from the limelight, this fear is still present in the United States. While he's kind of the best example and manifestation of that fear, the fear does persist. However, there's another aspect of this Red Scare known as the Lavender Scare that is going to be far more impactful. Virtually zero, pretty sure 0 communists were found in the US government and fired for being a communist. However, the Lavender Scare, which targeted homosexuals in government, resulted in hundreds and thousands of homosexuals and relatives or friends of homosexuals being fired from their government jobs. So this aspect of the Red Scare is probably the worst that actually has some detrimental effects. So McCarthy, for all his kind of blowhard, all his boisterous yelling, didn't do much. But it's this Lavender Scare that has the most detrimental effect on the American society. Now, they push the government to issue something known, or the president to issue something known as Executive Order 10450. And it set security standards for federal employment and barred homosexuals from working in the federal government. President Eisenhower expanded the federal government's anti-homosexual policies and procedures to include every department and agency and every private corporation with a government contract, affecting the job security of more than 6 million workers and armed forces personnel. The executive order was also the cause for the firing of approximately 5,000 gay people from federal employment. This includes private contractors and military personnel. Not only did the victims lose their jobs, they were also forced out of the closet and thrust into public eye as being a lesbian or gay person. And this is where the real trauma hits, because at this point in time, social attitudes towards homosexuality were overwhelmingly negative. The psychiatric community regarded homosexuality as a mental disorder, as a flaw in humanity. Gay men and lesbians were considered susceptible to blackmail and thus constituting a security risk. So if you were secretly homosexual and you worked in the government, they thought that a communist spy could discover this information and blackmail you to keep you in their pocket, to force you to betray the United States. So US government officials assumed that communists would use this blackmail to sabotage the nation. So it wasn't McCarthy's hunt for communism that had the dramatic impact. It was this fear and paranoia of communism that drove this lavender scare and this hunt for homosexuals to be kind of targeted in this fear. It was a scapegoating of this fear on homosexuals rather than the real targets of true communist spies. But we'll stop there for this lecture, and we'll pick up next time with kind of the soldiers coming home during the 1950s and kind of how these GIs return home and get life going again when they get back to the United States after World War II.